left off that one day on week 4's presentation. And basically, we did not cover, to my knowledge, it looked like we didn't cover nominal, headroom, signal to noise, and noise floor, from what I recall. So I'm going to try to get into that real quick and just make sure that you're able to understand those things. So they're on the list, so this list has some items. Once we're done, I'm literally going to go top to bottom on this list, and then we'll probably have to take a break in there. I mean, if we have extra time, you know, we may just have some other fun thing to do, because I mean, we're such a small class today.
Do we have a lot today, or is it just book stuff?
Well, it's mostly planned for the book stuff today. Yeah, because I want to just make sure you guys are comfortable. Let's see. Let's slide down. I mean, if we end up with extra time, we'll just go talk about the console more if there's not still in there. Okay, nominal level. We did not cover this, right? Is that where we left off? Okay. So nominal level speaks to a couple of things, but the biggest thing that it speaks to is the nominal level has a couple of reference points. Like if I say turn that up to a nominal level, what I usually mean is a level at which it's the loudest a signal can be coming into a system that has some comfortable amount of headroom. And the definition of a headroom essentially is just making sure that there's space between the variable dynamics so that it doesn't clip. You know, so when we set up a mic input, a lot of times, or signal input of any sort, we will want to make sure that we, you know, turn it up to a certain degree, but we want to make sure that it's riding at its fullest, but it doesn't have the risk of clipping. Does that make sense? So if we turn it up too much, it might ride that line too closely and, of course, clip. But notice there's a couple other definitions. So if I say turn it up to nominal level, a lot of times you're looking at, well, okay, when the meters, I want to see the meters run, you know, kind of from the green into the yellow, but making sure that they don't clip into the red. But when I talk about nominal level on like a mixer, the nominal level on a mix console itself, in reference to the fader point, is actually known as 0 dB. And what it really references is there's no gain change from the input of the gain itself. So like when I plug in a mic right in here, and I use this to turn up the gain, when I set this fader to the 0 mark, also known as nominal, so I don't know if it actually points that out, but nominal on a mixing console's fader is also known as 0 dB. And if you move it to 0 dB, what that means is whatever volume this is has no alteration to it down below. Does that make sense? So whatever level I set this to, it's literally coming in, with this at nominal, it's coming in just as it was set from the preamp. And this is the interesting part, okay? Remember how many times we need a preamp ever in the lifetime of a source. How many times do we need it in the lifetime of the source? How many times do we need a preamp? One time, right? So ideally, if the one time we preamp something, it goes in from the console at nominal into the computer, and then back out of the computer at line level. If we then send it back out of the computer, back down the same channel, and we set it back to nominal, essentially the reference point that we should have is it should be the same volume that it was when we applied the gain initially. Does that make sense? So like nominal is kind of it's a reference point that essentially means that we're not going to adjust any of the signal levels at all. And there's a couple other definitions here. The rating isn't as important, but the way that it's set up is after line level signals enters into an amplifier speaker level, signals are output to your speakers, and the speaker level signals are post amplification. Oh, somehow there's an issue here. Should just say, sorry, this should really just say, to simplify some of the process, should have in addition to this 0 dB and no change to gain level. So nominal level really is equivalent to 0 dB or no change to the gain level, but it also, and 0 dB in reference to the fader output. And essentially we're trying to, with a nominal signal, trying to reach the point at which we're flexible enough that the dynamic surge on a mic source does not clip as well. So we're giving it the strength and the power, but not allowing it to clip. The noise floor is a little different. The noise floor is a level which, when no signal is passing, noise levels can be detected. Essentially what the noise floor is right now you're hearing me talk, right? And you can hear my signal good and strong. As soon as I stop talking, listen to what you hear making noise. That would be essentially the noise floor. Does that make sense? So when you're listening to that fan on the projector, there's your noise floor that you hear. Now notice, it's also listed as where the signal first rises above the noise, but it's in a kind of in a dB rating. All recordings have noise, but they are often not noticeable. It should be not, instead of no, based upon signal-to-noise ratio. So we're going to talk about that in a second. But in reality, you don't really necessarily hear noise, even though noise exists constantly. Your mind is designed to filter it out, and this is the weird part. Okay, so think about this. You probably noticed that. Dylan, you're sitting right there. You're sitting right here as well. Do you notice the fan noise on the projector? Do you eventually get to a point where you kind of block it out and stop focusing on it, and you start to focus on something else? Where you kind of forget about it, you know what I mean? To a certain degree. Does that make sense? Well, okay, so the interesting part is that your ears in the natural state are very forgiving because of the way that your mind interprets the data. So if I said, while I'm talking to you, when you leave the class, your biggest complaint isn't, oh man, that projector was really noisy, right? But if this was recorded audio and you heard that, you more than likely would go, wow, that's really noisy audio. And it's interesting because when you're in a live situation, your mind tends to block out or filter out some of the things that seem to be typical of a normal acoustical environment. But you're so programmed to what recorded audio should sound like that when you hear that same sound represented on a recorded piece of audio, all of a sudden you start to make a judgment based on the quality of the recording. Does that make sense? It's kind of odd. When you go back and listen to this video, you'll probably hear a lot of that. You'll probably hear fan noise. I don't know if you guys watched last week's video. You probably had a lot of fan noise in the background. But that's kind of what, that's kind of one of the things that you're looking at in terms of the way that your mind interprets the noise floor. In the signal-to-noise ratio, which hopefully I put next. Yes, I did. Let me get rid of this little blurb I put in. In the signal-to-noise ratio, the dB difference between the usable signal and the audio noise is really what we're looking at. So, and it's usable signal and audible noise. So like the signal that is triumphant over the noise. Higher signal-to-noise ratios are better. Now signal-to-noise is interesting because the signal-to-noise ratio is an actual given ratio that's provided for pieces of equipment. So like every piece of equipment, a mixer, well I should say this, every piece of equipment that has an actual onboard power transformer, or power transformer is maybe plugged in like a wall wart power transformer, but as long as there's some sort of power provided to the device, it's going to actually have some sort of signal-to-noise ratio because it's going to actually emit noise. So the device itself will emit noise. So the big key about that is that every device that you're really going to use that has any electricity passing through it is going to generate some amount of noise. And so the goal as a consumer when you buy these products is to look at the signal-to-noise ratio and value whether or not that piece of equipment is useful or not. Oh, you stole my chair.
Sorry.
It's all good. I was being lazy. I was sitting down over there.
It's all good. Everybody's lazy today.
So this is actually really key. They make, you guys haven't really started talking about them or dealing with them yet, but they make, these compressor devices. A lot of companies like Presonus and I'm trying to think who else has. I think Focusrite has a really cheap one. Oh, not DVX. Although DVX has a low end one. I'm trying to remember who the other company is. There's a company that has a really cheap one. Samsung has one of them and there's one more. And basically, when you buy a compressor, a physical outboard compressor, you usually want to spend, to be honest, somewhere around $300, $400, $500. If you get into the $1,000, $2,000 range, quality is going to be better. One of the things that changes is the signal-to-noise ratio as you get up into those upper levels. But you could go buy one. Oh, ART, that's it. That's who it is. ART, the company called ART. They're a fairly low-end company. You can go buy a tube compressor from ART, and the tube compressors are usually more expensive, so they're usually like in the $700, $800 range. You buy a tube compressor from ART for like $50. Problem is, go look at the signal-to-noise ratio, and you find out that the compressor is almost not usable. Because although it does a decent job of warming up the tone, because you're running through a tube, it technically has so much noise on the line that you can't do much with the signal. You know, and by compressing it, you actually emit more of the noise, which we'll talk about a little bit later, not today, but down the line. That's why when you're looking at some of these really cheap low-end products, one of the big questions you have to ask is, you know, a lot of times it's frequency response. You know, what is the quality of the frequency response? Another big thing is signal to noise. If you've ever turned on like an old speaker system or old stereo system, this is what older equipment really suffered from, the signal to noise ratio issue. Tape machines, all the time. You know, I don't know if you noticed last week when we were doing the tape machine, it was making a bunch of noise. But, you know, a lot of the older equipment in audio fails to have a clean signal through and through. And I'll just say this, how many times do you get a preamp? How many times do you use the preamp in the lifetime of the source? You said it. Once, right? Well, the interesting part is if noise is generated at the preamp, okay, if noise is generated and emitted from the preamp, it'll stay on that piece of audio for its lifetime. So you're really big, you know, a lot of times you're really trying to protect that piece of audio so it's not very noisy. One thing that actually does emit noise that most people don't think about is these large format consoles. So the signal-to-noise ratio is very, very important on these larger consoles, and it's the difference between whether or not you really want to route to the console before you hit the computer, or if you rather route direct to a preamp interface and bypass being routed through a console. And in the larger format consoles, where there's a lot of you know, the EQ and the compression and all that stuff down the line, remember I mentioned when we were looking at the block diagrams that the higher end consoles allow you to bypass some of the electronics if you're not using them. All for the purpose of generating a lower ratio so that you don't have to worry about so much signal loss. Now, headroom is a really big key for you guys. It's the level above nominal but before distortion. And essentially, it's the amount, so nominal essentially was that, nominal is that sweet spot, like that cap where we like to be, you know, that gives us some room before distortion. So if you were to think about it visually, if I just said from a level standpoint, if I said, okay, here, I'm going to use this as 0. And if I just said, well, of course this, actually these marks won't really necessarily be needed, but if I said this is distortion, and this is distortion on the positive and negative, because remember that the cycle goes up and down. And I basically said, you know, at the level that I set this is our nominal. Then the distance between this, essentially the, well actually really it's not that, it's still between this. The distance between the nominal space and where we would hit distortion is called headroom. And actually it doesn't so linearly exist like this. Headroom only, like if you were to snapshot headroom, it's always the space between the nominal and the distortion. So when I talk like this, if I had already set up a level for my mic, I actually have more headroom. But as soon as I get exuberant, the headroom diminishes, right? Does that make sense? But the idea is by leaving a certain amount of space, it keeps us from ever having the risk of distortion. So providing an amount of headroom. Now, and that's why it talks about the extra dynamics without distortion. Headroom must be provided when setting signal levels during the recording process. I'll tell you this is how recording works, okay? When you're in there recording, always, I got a drum set going. I got my nominal levels rocking, okay? Someone's playing the drums, all right? But so far, we've only kind of tested it out, all right? Now all of a sudden, he's playing the real music. What does he do? He gets more excited. He starts hitting harder. The dynamic variance just changed from the mic check to the actual performance. So a lot of times when you're setting up musicians, one of the things you always ask for is them to really play like they're going to play. I always ask when they're behind the glass, can you just play like you're going to play? Happens all the time with vocalists. Vocalists always do this. They'll get behind the mic and be like, and then you set them all up, and then the next thing they do is screamo, and you're like, dude, like if you were gonna do that, you need to test it like that. Like we have to have it tested like that. Yeah, I don't know if you guys ever listened to screamo, but screamo is a great example because every now and then you'll see like the vocalists go from singing to screaming, and then there's all those kind of things. Those are all different setups in terms of the gain stage. You couldn't just set the gain once and let it ride for the whole thing because you have to find the nominal level for each section, and you have to make sure there's an adequate amount of headroom for each section. One of the things that's interesting, female vocalists, when they belt, when they really give it their all, they suffer from the same situation where you really do have to go back in and reset the overall gain levels, make sure they're at nominal for those ranges, and that there's headroom left. Because one of the live tricks that we use a lot of times is when I'm going to sing loud into a microphone, what do? I'm going to give more. What's that? Pull it away. That's not an adequate fix for in the studio. The biggest reason why is when you pull it away, remember what proximity effect does. You guys remember what proximity effect does? Proximity effect adds more low-end response when we're within that 6-inch range. So if I go all of a sudden from like a 4-inch space to all of a sudden being a foot away, I just changed the frequency balance in what's going on into the microphone. Does that make sense? The other thing is as I get farther away, you hear more of the room. So all of a sudden it went from sounding nice and crisp, and then they try to step back, and all of a sudden it's like they're in the bathroom, or in the bedroom. And it's like it just changed. So what you do instead is, that's what's really hard for live vocalists. Live vocalists want to just constantly do this. And it's like, just fix yourself in a nice restful position and just be there and do what it takes. And that's why, surprisingly, this is why it's such a big deal when you find a recording artist that's also a great live artist, because they don't necessarily have congruent elements that are required of them. And you think about it, like I always tell vocalists, hey, just consider yourself an actor, okay? And you have the ability to act live on stage, and you have the ability to act in front of the camera. They're two very different elements, but you have to be able to play both roles if you're going to be an on-stage singer and a studio artist, okay, a recording artist, because you have to kind of get used to the fact that it's just you and the mic, And I would get that complaint every now and then from vocalists. Oh, there's not enough energy. I'm so used to being in front of a live stage. All right, but every other live performer that's come before you that's made a recording has figured out how to do this. So a lot of times you just have to make sure that you're keeping an eye on the headroom. And this is actually another thing. Once like guitars are a great example. Electric guitars, anything with an amp. Once they set those levels, you got to set those levels first. Then you go in and mic them and you change and you set up their gain. Don't be chasing it the other way, and it happens a lot of times. So let's just turn it up. Oh, then that means my gain has to go down, on the inside of the booth. And that's why what I like to do a lot of times, like with the drummers, is I don't set up mics first. Let the drummer get in and set up the kit first. Let the drummer feel out the kit, have everything set first. As soon as that's set first, we can mic all around them, and we get all the gain stages we need. But as soon as they get all set up and they want to make a move or a change or something, we have to go back and redo it for nominal levels and making sure we have enough headroom. Dynamic range. Dynamic range essentially is the range of volume. It's basically just a measurement of from this particular level to this particular level. So if you haven't I'll just say this. Bass players are like a bass guitar is a very even-keeled instrument when it comes to dynamic range, comparative to things like strings or piano or especially vocals. The vocals are usually, some of the most extreme. But again, more variation helps to create sonically enhanced recordings. Some instruments do not require a large dynamic range. And that's very true. One of the things that you'll learn as you move on from the whole idea of the recording technique and move into the mixing technique is that kick, a lot of times, bass, and snare. They're allowed to have some dynamic flux, but it's very minimal because essentially they make the foundation of any essentially pop music song. And if the kick was to vary in volume every time it kicked, it would really change how the structure would feel. It'd be very unstable, especially if all of a sudden you run a sub, you play that through a sub, and all of a sudden you're feeling the sub, boom, boom. But instead of it being consistent, it was like, boom, 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 boom. And, it kind of just doesn't work in terms of that. So a lot of times what you want is a little less dynamic range in there. But a recording produces variables in volumes of decibel. But in the dynamic range element, that's something we have to consider when we're looking at equipment, is what kind of dynamic range does it offer. Surprisingly, you may not, obviously, you're new to this, you may not be aware. The dynamic range of this console versus the dynamic range of that console versus the dynamic range of the console in the rack over here, they're all different. Which is why when you go from one console to another console, one mixer to another mixer, they don't sound alike. There are clear night and day differences just based upon the dynamic abilities. Remembering that when we use a transducer, what is the transducer doing? Right? The transducer is representing the material, right? And how well it does that, with a dynamic range element, will give us either more sonically enhanced sound or less. So it's very important to consider the fact that on cheaper equipment, you're looking at a lot of times a smaller dynamic range, higher noise than the signal-to-noise ratio. And then, of course, you may have some sort of variations of the abilities to have some sort of quality. A lot of the mixers that are on the cheaper end also suffer from something called crosstalk. And all that really means is when the electronics share a circuit or share their circuit board, that they tend to actually communicate from one channel to another just by having electrical circuits that are neighboring. Which means that if I'm supposed to be running, a singer on channel 1 and a singer on channel 2, that when I mute channel 1, it's still possible on cheaper equipment to still hear channel 1 bleeding through channel 2. But so that's why we had this conversation. Who joined us late? Oh, here you go. All right, so I have access here to all of the presentations, and I want to just kind of jump through some of these. Some of these you're going to need, you may have questions on, or you may need some specific visuals. I think one of them that we didn't get to was the conversation about balanced versus unbalanced cable and shielded versus unshielded cable. And then I think everything else we really touched upon, so I'll probably, I'm sorry, down at the bottom it says SPIDIG, and it's supposed to say SPIDIF. It should be Sony Philips Digital Interface with an F instead of a G. I don't know. My fat thumbs must have punched that in, so I apologize. Let me get a visual up on screen for you. Now this wasn't in the slides, but this was in the chapter, and I don't know if this is necessarily the, well, this one will work, but let me go see if I can show you. Right, you guys got that far, right? Were you reading the chapter about cable?
Yeah, that was the homework we had for this week.
Cable design. Okay, so first of all, let's just say there's a ton of cable out there, and there's a lot of variables in the cable type that we deal with. But I just want to talk just briefly just about some of the differences between balanced and unbalanced cables, and let me show you. Let me show you a visual representation through the means of, not this, but actually bringing one out. I mean, you can see this pretty easily. Although I don't know if we have any unbalanced cable. Oh. Okay, so balanced and unbalanced cable essentially basically just means that there's either two conductors, there's either essentially one conductor, or really it's two conductors, one of them is the ground, or 3 conductors where 2 of them are live and 1 of them is the ground. So, and the big difference here is, and you can easily see it, this is a balanced jack, this is a balanced jack. This essentially is known as tip ring sleeve, TRS. I don't know if you can see that back there. This is known as, you can pass around, TRS, tip ring sleeve. What happens is the sleeve is always the ground. So on this one, that's just a tip sleeve. The sleeve is always the ground. So if we open this up, you'll see the ground hits that terminal. And then you end up having hot and cold on the tip and the ring. And on this one, it only has a tip. The difference between these, the unbalanced ones are great for instruments. If you want to plug in a guitar, it's unbalanced. You want to plug in a bass, it's unbalanced. Technically, if you want to plug in a keyboard, you'd actually prefer to use balance because they support balance. And the question mark really comes, when to use balance versus unbalanced? Well, ideally, let's just talk about this. The point of the matter is that on a balanced cable, the balanced cable actually sends two versions of the signal, okay? It sends 2 duplicates, or 1 duplicate really, but it's two of the same signal down the line. And then it has the ground, and they both need a ground, just as the way we're used to in common electricity. They all need a ground to keep them grounded and from having any noise issues. But what they do with this, and there's a really nice visual over here, I think. What they do is they send these signals out of phase from each other. They send them or transmit them out of phase from each other. So it's the same signal, but they invert the phase. They send them on down the line. Well, by being transmitted down the line as just a general factor of being a cable, like they're prone to noise. It's just their deal. They will eventually start to pick up noise because there's electricity on the line. What happens is when the noise gets picked up and it gets all the way to the terminating section where it's plugged into, the device at the other end will flip the phase of these items so that they're back in phase. And by doing so, by putting these guys in phase, they flip the noise out of phase, and the noise actually cancels itself out. Follow me on that? All right, so I'll give it to you one more time. So, maybe I'll point it out on here for anybody who's missing today. So the signal is sent, two of the same signal are sent on a balanced line. They're out of phase from each other, and essentially they cancel each other out if they were heard in that state. The noise is picked up through transmission, and then when they get to the input, they're flipped back into phase with each other, and because the noise was in phase prior, now it'll be out of phase, and essentially there will be no noise on the line. Now, and that actually works out quite well because it's a literal duplicate of the noise. Now, if there were differences and variances between the noise on both of the lines, then you'd have still some sort of noise bleed. The lines are so close in proximity that they really are generally picking up verbatim the same information. Now, again, kind of going back to this, okay, so TRS, tip ring sleeve, is our balanced line. When it becomes I didn't bring one out. When it comes to these mic cables, I thought I had one in my hand. When it comes to your mic cables, they are technically all balanced cables. So the these quarter inches are allowed to be balanced or unbalanced. They're the mic cables, because they already are a 3-conductor device with the 3 pins, these will always be balanced, unless you went in and cut one out, or didn't terminate one at the line. Sometimes they do that when they had a 1/4-inch connector, unbalanced on one side, and on the other side they had an XLR. What they'll do is they'll share one of the pins, but it really won't actually effectively do anything. So the key here is when would you use one versus another? Well, your common day guitar, your electric guitar, when you plug it into your amp, it does not have the ability to invert that phase. So essentially it's not designed to even receive 3 conductors, it's designed to receive 2. And that's why you may have unbalanced cables connected to devices. So you wouldn't actually plug a balanced cable into a guitar and plug it into an amp, because the amp does not receive balanced signals. Does that make sense? Most everything else will that's in the pro-grade system. So when you're plugging line level stuff in, it's going to require balanced cables. And a lot of times it'll say, balanced cables, or the manual will say balanced cables only, or whatever. The real difference is you could use an unbalanced cable on a balanced line. It just more often than not is noisy. And it won't carry very far, because of its noise. Like if you had to run like a 200-foot run of it, you're not going to really have much success. Where the balance lines, you get to do that. Make sense? Balanced, unbalanced? Okay. In addition to this, although I don't know if I can show you very much, let's see. There was also a conversation about shielded versus unshielded cable. And there are a couple of variables and variances designed in shielded and unshielded cable. Basically what happens is, in an unshielded cable, what they call essentially twist pairs, and I think the initials, I don't know if they're unshielded twisted cable, right? So essentially UTC, and the book might have mentioned that. What they do, and that's what these images are, is instead of having a shield to add additional RF coverage so that we don't have any interference down the line from radio frequencies, what they do is they twist the pairs. Notice these are all twisted. The thing about this is twisted pairs are fine for things like Ethernet and for things like telephone lines. Like the twisted pair system works for very low level, low conducting, low energy devices and low energy communication. The problem really exists, and it's the same thing as like your home antenna. I don't know if you guys use antennas at home. I still do because I got rid of cable. I'm like, just use an antenna. The difference is cheaper antennas or unpowered antennas don't really pick up as well as the powered ones do because they're not powerful enough to receive signals from farther away. And the same thing happens with your cables. When you're running low levels of power down your line, there's not a huge risk of RF interference. But once you supply a ton of power down your line, if it's unshielded, it'll literally pick up radio stations. When I was in college, we had a rehearsal space. They had the, I forget what it was called, but it was basically a practice house. It was like a house. The campus I went to, it was kind of eclectic like that. Like the stage room where all the rock bands and stuff would play live shows was literally a house that they converted, which was like a huge empty room and had a stage and lights and all that fun stuff. And then there was a rehearsal space, and every band had to put in a bid for a room, and it would be a lottery system. You get put in a room, and you'd have it for the whole semester, and it'd be you'd have a whole room like this. Okay, a little smaller, but and it would be your practice room for the entire semester. And so my freshman year, we had a practice room for the entire semester, and we had the cheapest everything you could think of in there. Cheapest mics, cheapest cable. We were like, well, the room's a little live. We need to put some sound dampening on there. Well, when we were looking at it, weighing it out, okay, foam costs too much. The foam things you put under your sleeping bag cost too much. We ended up just going to Lowe's and buying insulation pads, fiberglass, which we didn't really think about the fact that really burns your skin when you touch it. So when we went and installed it, it was painful afterwards, of course. So we have this room, and constantly, when we're not playing, and all you hear is the noise floor, all you start to hear is a radio station. Now the radio station tower for the college radio station was literally like maybe 1,000 feet away. But when you're running cheap unshielded cable down these long lines, and we had a bunch of speaker cables that were unshielded, that's what you get. And that's why this will work for telephone lines, low powered stuff. Okay, so that's why you're like, why would anybody use unshielded cable? Because it works for low powered stuff, and it doesn't necessarily require it. But this is that unshielded twisted pair. Where shielded cable, there's several different types. And I don't know if, oh yeah, they do show some of them here. Several different types. Essentially, it's set up and designed for, certain cables set up and designed for more powerful specifications. So when you're running a shielded, tip ring sleeve, TRS, 1/4 inch, it's actually not as shielded as your standard XLR. And the reason why is because this will at times require phantom power, 48 volts, right? Remember phantom power? Where this one won't. A lot of times you're going to use this for line level, right? Where you don't even need that much power running through. And if you remember the way that it ends up setting it up, if we were to take a look inside, I'm going to actually open this up. Oh. Oh shoot, I don't want to open that up. Oh man, I might not want to open this one up either. I should have brought our standard screw connector. These ones have, I don't want to. Oh, you know what? No. It's just, it's the way that this is going to pop off. Yeah, you're not going to, but this is the problem. No, you don't need a screwdriver for it. Well, you don't need to pry it. The problem is that the way it's designed, the way this is designed in a standard screw-on, as soon as I open that, you see the cable. Like the cable's exposed. With this method, it's essentially choked, and there's a very limited range of which you can see. So it's not as visible. Like you can't really see it as well. Yeah, because normally when they open, they're not usually this tight, so you can't really see much of it. But inside of the pair, you can see in this one. Well, actually, you can barely see it. This one's shielded. It looks like this one's shielded with the foil method, and this is right here is one of them. Maybe you've seen these. In the foil method, it's literally just a sheet of foil wrapped around the overall insulation. If you wanted to get ultra insulated, what you could do is you could set it up so that every single line, notice it's wrapped around all three in this image down here. You could actually set it up so it was wrapped around each individual. But instead, for cost's sake, a lot of times they'll just dump them around the whole thing. The other thing you can also do is these braided coils. I don't know if that's too visible or not. Let me see if I can broaden that up so you can see it. And it literally is just a metal braid wrapped around the whole thing. And sometimes you'll even see metal braids with the foil still on the inside of the. And what happens is if you look at the cable, I never knew this. When I was a kid, I thought it was fascinating. I remember, it's so funny. So I met somebody that, when I was a kid, it's somebody that went to my church, and they were telling me what they did for a living, and they were like, "Oh yeah, I make cable," and I was like, "You make cable?" I mean, I was like a little, I was just getting into audio. I was a little kid, and I thought it was so fascinating, and I didn't even realize that they didn't really make cable. A lot of these places, what they do is they get the cable on the spools, and all they literally do is snip it off and solder this in, and now they made a cable, and it's not really like they're fabricating the cable. But what's interesting about it is you could combine any cable with any connector, but it's going to change the quality of the actual connection based upon what you do. So if you ever look really closely on here, this one actually says it's a Neglex 2549 microphone cable from Megami. Megamis are really quite expensive. And actually, if I know these guys well enough, they particularly purchased Megami, a spool of Megami cable, and Ron probably made these himself. Because what he would have done is picked out nitric ends, which are more expensive, either the high-end quarter-inch ends, put it with a high-end cable. Where you look at this one's a prefab Whirlwind, and it may or may not have information on it. Oh, well, it does. Oh, that doesn't say much. This just says low Z, which means low impedance Whirlwind cable. I don't see any other markings that say, because this is proprietary, which means that the cable is made by the same group that makes the jack. Oh, so they make this, through and through. Where a lot of the companies, higher end companies, will have like a specific cable and a specific jack. The Neutrik ones are really popular. But that kind of solves some of the mystery as to why or why not. Big thing with this is the shielded versus unshielded. Like your headphone wire on your headphones that you use, if you were to ever open them up, are typically designed in a little bit of a different method where they usually use foil. There's not a ton of power being delivered, but they also have these interesting braided ends where instead of like you see here where it's like this all pure copper, it's like this synthetic conducting kind of wire. Which allows it to be thinner than most of your copper wires that you see, which is why your headphone cables are like so itty bitty, versus your microphone cables, which are pretty burly in terms of the gauge. All right, questions on that? Let's talk a little bit about some of these connection types, and then we'll just jam down the list. Okay, actually, let's do this. I'm going to block this out just for a second.